Hey everybody, it's Blake, and today I'm going to be talking about conditionality. Conditionality is a really important concept to understand strategy wise when getting into more progressive LD debate. It's kind of foundational if you're going to move your way towards the more progressive side of LD. Um, and yeah, so we'll start by just defining what exactly conditionality is. So, the exact definition of conditionality is the quality of being dependent on certain specified conditions. In the context of debate, we use conditionality to refer to the status of an argument in regards to whether or not it can be kicked. So, you can also think of that as meaning essentially answering the question, are there conditions in which a given argument can be kicked out of in rebuttals? So, in debate, when we say we kick out of something, it means that we no longer are going for that argument to try to win the round. We're just going to leave that argument behind in the previous speech. We're not going to carry it through to the end. And we don't think the judge should consider it when making their decision. So basically, conditionality then is the question of whether or not a certain argument can be left behind, or whether or not you should be forced to carry it all the way through to the end and defend it all the way to the end. So, what kind of arguments can be conditional? The short answer is any negative advocacy. So, that includes K alternatives and counterplans, every type of counterplan out there under the sun, including picks. And one thing that's important to note is that the AF does not have conditionality in the same sense that the neg does. So the contention level of an AF or advantage level of an AF is essentially conditional in that you cannot go for a contention or you can kick out of an advantage. But the advocacy itself is not conditional because the AF has a burden to advocate the resolution. So if you were to kick out of the advocacy, you kick out of the resolution and you're no longer meeting that AF burden. Now, that being said, of course, the AF can win the round without winning that the resolution is true by winning, RVIs on theory or IVIs somewhere else, up layering. But essentially, when we talk about conditionality as a concept in debate, we're talking about the status of neg advocacies. So every time the neg reads an advocacy, you should ask the question in cross-ex, what's the status of the advocacy? What's the status of the K alternative? What's the status of the counterplan? It basically binds them to an answer so they can't shift the status in the rebuttal to moot your response. So for instance, if they originally read it with the intention of never kicking out of it, but you didn't ask them the question of whether or not they can kick out of it, then they can just decide to, in their next speech, kick out of it. Change their strategy plan, and they've essentially wasted all the time that you used responding to it. So every time the neg reads an advocacy, you should be asking what the status of that advocacy is. In the same vein as every time the neg reads an advocacy, you should make a perm against that advocacy. I'm working on a video on perms right now, so hopefully that will be out soon. If you're not sure what a perm is, basically Cliff's Notes. It's short for permutation. It is a test of competition to see if it's possible to do the neg advocacy and the affirmative, or if doing the affirmative would preclude the possibility of doing the neg advocacy. But to get back to the focus of this video with conditionality, if you ask the question, what's the status of the K-alt, or what's the status of the counterplan, there are three widely recognized answers to this question. The status can be conditional, dispositional, or unconditional. So conditional means that the neg can kick the advocacy for any reason. So they get to basically make the decision at any point in the round, I no longer want to go for this counterplan, I'm going to kick out of it. Dispositional means that there are defined conditions under which the neg will kick the advocacy. So that's basically the same as conditionality, except there are specific conditions under which it is kicked. It's not just they can decide at any point. They have to lay out the criteria, and if that criteria is met, then they will kick out of it, and if that criteria is not met, they will not kick out of it. If somebody says that the status is dispositional, you should always ask under what specific conditions will the advocacy be kicked. It's the same principle as asking what the status is in the first place. You want to make sure that they can't shift the answer later in the round just to benefit them strategically. And the last common, widely accepted status that an advocacy can have is unconditional, meaning that the negative cannot kick out of the advocacy in any circumstance, no matter what. So these kind of function as a spectrum where conditional gives the neg the most leniency in terms of when they want to kick out of something, and unconditional gives them no leniency and says you can never kick out of it. And this is something that the negative debater gets to specify in the cross-examination period when you ask them this question. Now, that being said, you might be thinking, why would anybody ever choose to say that their advocacy is unconditional when conditionality gives them the most latitude? Well, it all comes down to theoretical concerns. In other words, possible theory arguments that could be read. So consider the eventual implication of allowing infinite conditional advocacies. So if an NC reads 4 different advocacies, how are you going to balance your time between all of them if you know that they could just kick out of all of them and go for a dissat or something like that in the last speech? How do you balance your time without wasting your time? And the answer to that is essentially that conditionality is not a rule of debate. It is not anywhere in the rule book that says the negative gets conditional status on X advocacies or whatever. Basically, in every round, you have the right to contest whether or not the neg has the right to read conditional advocacies. So how do you manage time when there's 4 advocacies in the NC? You get up and you argue that condo is bad and that the negative shouldn't get conditionality. So you're trying to bind them into being unable to kick out of those advocacies so that when you answer them, you're no longer wasting your time because you know that they won't just kick out of it. So the question then is, when is it worth it to get up and read a theory argument in the 1AR that says that conditionality is bad? When is it worth initiating the condo debate? If there's one conditional advocacy, generally I say don't bother initiating the condo debate. You probably won't win any substantial abuse story. On the theory level, it's hard to believe that just one conditional advocacy completely skewed your whole strategic opportunities. 2 conditional advocacies is sort of a gray area in LD. In other forms of debate, like policy debate, 2 advocacies is not that outrageous. So 2 conditional advocacies is always kind of a gray area, but in LD especially so because of how short that 1AR is. At any point where there's 3 or more conditional advocacies, I would say pretty confidently that the 1AR should include a condo shell, arguing that conditionality is bad. And that's because at the point where there's 3 or more conditional advocacies, you're going to be hard-pressed to balance your time between them in an effective way that isn't just going to get mooted by the kick that comes in the 2N. So what does the condo bad 1AR theory shell look like? Well, so I have a separate video, Intro to T/Theory, to talk more about the structuring of an argument. So if you're unfamiliar with T or theory, I strongly recommend you check that video out and then come back to watch this portion of the video because I'm going to be throwing around some terms that might not make a ton of sense if you don't have that background knowledge. But essentially the condo bad theory shell, the interp, can do 2 things. It can either specify a number as an upper limit on conditional advocacies. For example, the negative debater may not read more than 1 conditional advocacy. So you're saying, one condo is acceptable, but any more than that is a theory violation. Or you can just go for general conditionality bad. The negative debater may not read conditional advocacies, period. It doesn't matter how many there are. You just shouldn't read them. And that is generally preferred if you want better warranting in the standards, because if you specify a specific number of conditional advocacies that's acceptable, you then have to defend why, 1 conditional advocacy is not abusive, but 2 would be. Whereas if you just defend generally condo is bad under any circumstances, you just have to prove that any number of conditional advocacies is a problem. And then the flip side of that is some people would say that a more specific interp that allows 1 or 2 conditional advocacies is generally going to be perceived better in terms of it's a specific rule, so there's less violations, which means that it's less hard line, like in every scenario. Like a hard line rule that says in every scenario condo is bad, you can probably find exceptions to it, whereas if you get more specific and provide a number, then it's harder to find places where that rule wouldn't apply. So there's pros and cons to both approaches. I generally think it depends on the nature of the round in order to make that call. But keep both of those ideas in your back pocket. The violation, I would pull a direct quote from CrossX and specify the number of conditional advocacies that they have, just to make sure that you're really crystal clear in the violation. Some of the common standards that you might see associated with condo bad, and these are not by any means an exhaustive list, but a few of them. Reciprocity, because the AF only gets one advocacy, so the neg should only get access to one advocacy. Time skew, the 1AR has 4 minutes to cover every flow, where the 2N can just kick the CP or kick the alt or whatever and spend more time, a whole 6 minutes, on less flows, so it's a pretty drastic time skew. And then you also have depth of education. If there's multiple advocacies, we don't get to dig deep on any of them and really understand any single advocacy, because we're balancing our time between 4 different advocacies. In your 1AR shell, you're going to want to read paradigm issues, so that would be drop the debater, probably no RVIs, probably competing interps, but the drop the debater part is the most important, because that's like your impact, right? If you don't read an impact, you can't weigh the argument, so you have to read drop the debater. And then the other 2 things are probably a very good idea. You could also potentially make the argument that 1AR theory is the highest layer in the round. Typically, this is more persuasive if there's warrants in the AC that say that if 1AR theory is initiated, it would be the highest layer. But you can theoretically go for it in the 1AR. It's just a little bit less persuasive than if it's rooted in something in the AC. Now, from the negative perspective, the condo good counter shell that would be read in the 2N. Again, there's an answering T-theory video that I would recommend you watch and then come back to this video if you're unfamiliar with how to structure a response to T-theory. But essentially, the counter interp for condo good, generally I recommend that if you are going for condo good, you specify the number of advocacies in your shell, just because defending generalized condo good is difficult for the same reason why defending generalized condo bad might be a little bit more difficult, but to a more extreme extent, because if you are defending that condo is generally good, you have to hypothetically defend that the neg can read up to infinite conditional advocacies, whereas if you just specify a number of advocacies that are acceptable, like 2 conditional advocacies or whatever, then it's a lot easier to defend the fairness and educational value of that practice. As some examples, again, not an exhaustive list, but a few of the standards that condo good might use: neg flex, the AF gets infinite prep time. Flex is key to being able to respond to 1AR re-explanations of the AF. So essentially, the AF gets to prep all the way leading up to the round. The neg does not know what the AF is going to be until the round starts, so the neg only has a very limited amount of time to put their case together. So it's important that the neg has flexibility so that they can respond to the increased latitude that is provided by the infinite prep time of the AF. Real world education and actual policy making, there's no limit on proposed ideas. We just learn how to evaluate multiple advocacies. If we're trying to solve a problem in the real world, it's better to throw out multiple solutions and weigh them against each other. And then breadth of education. This is the opposite of depth of education, like we saw in the condo bad shell. So the breadth of education argument is that if there are multiple advocacies, we learn the basics of more ideas, and that's more helpful for debate, because debate is not meant to be an exhaustive education on one subject, but it's supposed to be an introduction to multiple different ideas that we can then take into the real world and further develop those ideas ourselves. It's better to be aware of everything than it is to be an expert on only one thing, is essentially the thesis of breadth of education. So some final thoughts on conditionality. Use the status to inform your response in the 1AR. In other words, if the advocacy is conditional, you don't want to spend an entire 2 minutes of the 1AR on it, especially if you don't go for condo bad, because then the advocacy is just going to get kicked out of, and it's going to be 2 minutes wasted of the 1AR. And an important disclaimer in as far as status informing your response, a K can still be a linear disad if the advocacy is kicked. In other words, even if they don't go for the alternative, they can still go for the link and impact part of the K to argue a reason why the AF is a bad idea. So just because the alternative is conditional does not mean that you should undercover the K. You still should do some line by line on the link story, just so that way they don't have that option of going for a linear disad, and that those parts of the case being essentially conceded in the 1AR. Another piece of advice for the AF uplayer against neg advocacies, uplayering arguments like IVIs or independent voting issues, are things like contradictions bad. So if they read two advocacies that cannot be implicated or implemented at the same time or in concert with each other, that's a bad thing because it sets bad models for education. Problematic language, so any kind of language or rhetoric or anything that is used in the NC, any part of it, that can be read as an independent voting issue. All of these things, these IVI's independent voters, are still valid if the advocacy is kicked. So if you are saying that they use problematic language and they should lose because they used problematic language, kicking out of that advocacy doesn't mean that you didn't use the bad language. It just means you're trying to get away from it, but you still did it, and there still should be a decision that penalizes that bad behavior by voting against the negative in that instance. So independent voting issues still matter even if the advocacy gets kicked out of, so uplayering on advocacies is a really good strategic option. And lastly, dispositional is basically conditional in disguise. That's a little bit of a controversial way to put it, but generally speaking, people that say, it's dispositional is just saying that, they can kick out of it when they want, and they'll just provide the criteria that they would have used to make the decision for a conditional advocacy anyway. So just because they say dispositional, don't think that means that condo bad is off the table. You can probably just change the word condo to dispo and do a little bit of tweaking on your standards, and you'll still have a pretty persuasive dispo bad shell. So don't think dispositional is entirely separate from condo, and think that you can't initiate the debate if it is dispo. So that's all I have for this video. Like I said, this is a really important foundational concept for progressive debate strategy. And so please let me know if you have any questions. Leave a comment or reach out or anything like that. Otherwise, have a good rest of your day.